They threw stones at the carriage before it even reached the palace gates. Clara sat perfectly still beside Orion, her wedding dress still dusted with the flowers the crowd had trampled instead of thrown, and listened to a kingdom scream her husband's name like a curse instead of a title. Traitor! Someone shouted. Kinslayer! Human! Orion did not flinch. He simply reached over without looking at her and took her hand in his, in front of guards who would not meet his eyes, in front of a crowd that had once cheered his name. Clara had believed, for one single afternoon, that love might be enough to survive anything. She had no idea how wrong and how right she was about to be proven. If you want to know what it costs to love someone your whole world tells you not to, subscribe to Elf Stories, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're listening from tonight. Let's begin. Clara had spent her entire life being almost noticed, almost chosen, almost enough. She had grown up in Fen Hollow, a border town too small for the elven court to care about, and too strange, in the eyes of other humans, for anyone there to fully trust her either. A girl who spent her childhood teaching herself the old elven tongue from a single water-damaged book she'd found in her late father's belongings, reciting words no one around her understood, dreaming of a world that had never once invited her in. Her mother had died when she was young, and her father, a quiet translator who worked the border crossings, had raised her with more books than affection, more silence than warmth. He was not unkind. He simply did not know how to be present with a daughter he had never expected to raise alone. Clara learned early that she could earn brief moments of his attention by being useful, by translating a difficult passage correctly, by anticipating what he needed before he asked. She built her sense of worth on being useful, long before she understood that was what she was doing. She had a particular memory she returned to more than any other, though she rarely let herself dwell there. She had been perhaps 9 years old, standing at her father's elbow while he worked, when an elven trade official complimented her quick grasp of the old tongue in front of him. Her father had simply nodded, already turning back to his papers, and said, "She's useful for her age. Not proud, not warm. Simply an assessment." The way one might describe a tool that had proven sturdier than expected. Clara had smiled at the compliment anyway, because it was the closest thing to praise she had learned to expect, and she had spent the rest of her childhood quietly chasing more of it. By the time she was grown, Clara had become an excellent translator herself, working the same border post her father once had, greeting elven merchants and officials with a fluency that startled them and a face they mostly forgot the moment they moved on. She was competent. She was reliable. She was, in the quiet way that stings more than outright cruelty, invisible. She did not resent it exactly. She had simply stopped expecting anything else. She told herself that a quiet, useful life was a safe one, that wanting more than that was how people ended up disappointed. She had watched other girls in Fen Hollow dream of grand romances and grander lives, and watched most of those dreams quietly die under the weight of ordinary days. Clara had decided, somewhere in her early 20s, that she would rather never hope for something extraordinary than hope for it and lose. There had been one girl, a childhood friend named Petra, who used to whisper about the kind of love that changed a person's entire life, the kind sung about in traveling minstrels' ballads. Petra had married young, full of that same hope, and by the time Clara turned 23, Petra was already worn thin by a husband who barely noticed her, and 3 children she raised largely alone. Clara had loved her friend too much to say so aloud, but she had privately decided, watching Petra's bright eyes dim year by year, that perhaps hope itself was the trap, that the safest way to never be disappointed was to never let herself want anything large enough to be taken away. What she feared most, more than loneliness, more than being overlooked, was being wanted for what she could do rather than who she was. She had watched her father value her only for her usefulness. She did not think she could survive discovering that everyone else in the world worked the same way. So, when the elven envoy's carriage broke an axle outside Fen Hollow on a rain-soaked evening, and a tall, travel-worn stranger walked into the border post, asking in halting common tongue whether anyone could help translate an urgent letter to the local magistrate, Clara did not think of him as anyone significant. She simply did what she always did. She was useful. She translated the letter correctly, quickly, without asking questions about the elven noble standing in her doorway, with rain in his hair and an exhaustion in his eyes that had nothing to do with the weather. She did not learn his name that night. She would not learn until much later that the man she had helped without a second thought was heir to the entire elven throne, traveling in disguise because for one evening he had wanted, badly, desperately, to be somewhere no one expected anything of him at all. There was one more thing Clara never told anyone, not even years later, that on the night before Orion's first visit, she had sat alone in her father's old study, surrounded by his books, and asked herself, half embarrassed by the question, what it might feel like to be wanted for no practical reason at all. She had not expected an answer. She had certainly not expected the answer to arrive, soaked from the rain, asking for her help, and then staying quietly, long after the letter was finished, simply to hear what she thought about something that had nothing to do with trade or translation at all. Clara went to bed that night, thinking nothing of the encounter. She had no way of knowing that a single ordinary act of kindness had just quietly begun to unravel everything she believed about her own unremarkable life. If this story has already found its way into your heart, subscribe to Elf Stories, hit like, and let us know where in the world you are listening from. There is so much more still ahead of her. He came back 3 weeks later, not in disguise this time, though Clara did not yet know that either. Simply a tall man in traveling clothes, asking again for help with a letter that she would later realize hadn't needed translating at all. You could have sent this to the court scribes, she said, only half joking, handing the parchment back to him. They're paid for this. They are, he agreed. But none of them argued with my grammar the way you did last time. Clara felt her face warm despite herself. No one argued with royalty. She still did not know in that moment that she had been doing exactly that. He introduced himself finally as Orion, a name common enough among elves that she thought nothing of it. And over the following months, his visits to Fen Hollow became less about letters and more about something neither of them named aloud. He asked her opinions and waited for her answers instead of simply expecting agreement. He noticed when she was tired before she said so. He laughed, genuinely, at her observations about elven customs that most nobles would have considered impertinent from a human border clerk. There was an afternoon midway through that first year when a sudden downpour trapped them both beneath the awning of the border post long after the office should have closed. Neither of them suggested leaving. They sat instead on overturned crates, sharing a single cup of tea between them, because Clara had only brewed one, and talked for 2 hours about nothing of consequence. Her father's old books, a festival Orion remembered fondly from childhood, the ridiculous formal titles elven court etiquette required for even the smallest interactions. Clara laughed harder that afternoon than she had in years, and caught herself mid-laugh, wondering when exactly she had stopped counting the minutes until he needed to leave, and started dreading them instead. For the first time in her life, Clara felt herself being seen for exactly who she was, not for what she could provide. It was Elder Fenwick, the town's oldest resident, and closest thing Fen Hollow had to a historian, who finally told her the truth, gently and with visible concern, over tea she had barely touched. "Child," he said, "Do you know who has been visiting you every fortnight for the better part of a year?" She did not. "That is Prince Orion," Elder Fenwick said quietly, "heir to the Silverglen throne, son of King Alaric, who has spent 30 years making certain that human and elven affairs never mix more than trade requires." Clara sat with that information, the way one sits with a wound, before realizing how deep it runs. Every conversation she had shared with Orion rearranged itself in her memory. No longer an ordinary man's kindness, but a prince's rebellion, quiet and deliberate, against everything his father's kingdom stood for. She should have stopped seeing him then. She told herself that night that she would. A border clerk and a crown prince were not simply an unlikely pairing. They were, by every law and custom she had ever heard whispered about, an impossibility that could only end badly for the one of them with no throne to protect her. But when Orion arrived the following fortnight, and she opened her mouth to tell him it needed to end, what came out instead was a question. "Why me?" she asked. "Out of an entire kingdom, why does the crown prince keep finding his way to a border post? No one important visits." Orion considered the question longer than she expected. "Because you're the only person in my life," he said finally, "who has never once wanted anything from me except my honest answer." Clara felt something in her chest shift at that. Not quite hope, not yet, but the first crack in a wall she had spent her whole life reinforcing. She thought of her father, of the compliment that was really a measurement, of every relationship she had built on being useful enough to keep. Orion had never once asked her to be useful. He had only ever asked what she thought. Clara understood in that moment, standing in the doorway of the only life she had ever known, that whatever came next would change everything, and that she had already, somewhere in the last year, stopped being able to imagine a life without him in it. If you're still with me, subscribe to Elf Stories, like this video, and tell us where you're listening from tonight. The story is only just beginning. What began as fortnightly visits became something neither of them could easily name or easily stop. Orion started arriving more often than duty could explain, and Clara stopped pretending, even to herself, that she did not count the days between his visits. They met at the edge of the Thornmere Woods, halfway between his world and hers, where neither elven guards nor human gossips thought to look. He taught her the proper pronunciation of words she had only ever read in her father's water-stained book. She taught him, in turn, how ordinary joy could look. A shared meal that wasn't a ceremony. A laugh that wasn't measured for political weight. A silence that didn't need to be filled with anything at all. He told her one evening about growing up the only child of a marriage built entirely on alliance rather than affection. His mother and father, dutiful strangers who shared a crown and little else, who had taught him, without ever meaning to, that love and duty were separate rooms in the same house, and that a prince was only ever permitted to live in one of them. "I used to think that was simply how it worked," he admitted, "until I met someone who made the walls between those rooms feel unnecessary." Clara, in turn, told him what she had never told anyone. The particular loneliness of being raised by a father who loved her, but never quite saw her, of building a life around being useful because she had never believed she could be wanted for anything else. Orion listened the way no one in her life ever had, without trying to fix it, without rushing to reassure her, simply present with the weight of what she was saying. It was in that mutual honesty, more than any single gesture, that Clara realized she had fallen in love with him. Not with the crown, which frightened her, not with the idea of him, which she had never allowed herself to indulge, but with the quiet, specific way he asked questions and actually waited to hear the answers. It was in that mutual honesty, more than any single gesture, that Clara realized she had fallen in love with him. Not with the crown, which frightened her, not with the idea of him, which she had never allowed herself to indulge, but with the quiet, specific way he asked questions and actually waited to hear the answers. There was a night, not long after, when Orion arrived at their meeting place clearly shaken, having just come from a council session about a border dispute that had left 3 soldiers dead. He did not perform composure for her the way she suspected he performed it for everyone else in his life. He simply sat beside her in silence, his hands trembling faintly, until she reached over and held one steady without being asked. "I don't know how to grieve where anyone can see me," he admitted quietly. "A prince isn't supposed to need to." Clara said nothing in response. She simply stayed, letting her presence be the only answer required, and understood, watching him slowly unclench, that she had just been given something far more intimate than any declaration of love could have offered. His fear, unguarded, trusted entirely to her. Obstacles arrived exactly as quickly as the feeling did. A merchant from Fen Hollow recognized Orion on one visit, and within days, rumors of the prince's border town companion had reached court circles. King Alaric summoned his son formally for the first time in months, not to discuss trade, not to discuss succession, but to ask, in a tone Orion had rarely heard from his father, whether the rumors held any truth. Orion did not lie. It was, Clara would later learn, the first time in his adult life he had refused his father a comfortable answer. The consequences arrived quickly. Clara found herself watched by unfamiliar faces in Fen Hollow, her movements reported back to the capital by people she had known her whole life. A letter arrived from an anonymous court official warning her, in carefully neutral language, that continuing to entertain the prince's attentions would end badly for someone in her position. A warning dressed as concern, though its intent was unmistakably a threat. Clara nearly ended it there. She told Orion one evening at their meeting place that perhaps Elder Fenwick had been right from the beginning, that some things were simply not meant to survive contact with the world outside a quiet border post. Orion took her hands in his, the way he had that first day at the carriage, and said the words that would define everything still to come. "I have spent my entire life being told what I'm allowed to want. I'm done asking permission for this one thing." Clara did not answer with words. She simply did not pull her hands away. And in the space where her fear had lived for so long, something steadier began, slowly to take root instead. If this story has you hoping for them, subscribe to Elf Stories. There are many more unforgettable tales waiting to be told. Before we continue, like this video and tell us in the comments where in the world you're listening from tonight. It helps this story reach more hearts like yours. Their courtship, once it stepped fully into the light, unfolded slower than either of them expected. Not from hesitation, but from care. Orion refused to rush Clara into a world that had already shown her how cruel it could be. And Clara refused to let fear decide for her what she was and wasn't allowed to want. They were careful, deliberate, patient with each other in a way neither had learned from anyone before them. A hand offered across a crowded room, never taken until Clara was certain no unfriendly eyes were watching too closely. A quiet dinner at the palace, arranged under the guise of trade discussions, where Orion spent more time watching Clara's face than the documents in front of him. Small gestures of protection that asked for nothing in return. Orion quietly ensuring an escort accompanied Clara's father in spirit, Elder Fenwick, home safely after dark once the old man's support for Clara became known, and with it, a target for those who disapproved. Slowly, unmistakably, Clara let herself believe she was building something that might last. There was a particular evening Clara returned to often in memory. A quiet dinner Orion had arranged in a private garden away from court eyes, where he had, without any ceremony at all, simply asked her to teach him a children's rhyme her mother used to sing before she died. He butchered the pronunciation entirely, and Clara laughed until she cried, and for 1 full hour neither of them was a prince or a border clerk, only 2 people sharing something small and unremarkable and entirely their own. It was, she would later realize, one of the last purely uncomplicated nights they were allowed to have, before the kingdom's attention turned fully toward them. But the kingdom around them had not softened, and every step forward in their relationship seemed matched by a step backward in how Silverglen received the idea of it. King Alaric, though he had not forbidden the courtship outright, made his disapproval known through silence, refusing to receive Clara formally at court, refusing to discuss the matter with his son beyond curt, closed-door conversations Orion never fully repeated to her. The queen, Orion's mother, remained even more distant, a coldness Clara felt every time their paths crossed at any function she was permitted to attend. Worse than the royal family's reserve was the court's outright hostility. Nobles who had once smiled politely at Orion now watched him with open calculation, as though reassessing what kind of king he might become, and whether that king was one worth their continued loyalty. Clara overheard, more than once, conversations that stopped abruptly when she entered a room, the particular silence of people who had just been discussing her. The hostility was not always so quiet. A merchant guild that had long supplied the palace kitchens quietly withdrew its contract rather than serve a court that had lost its standards. As one guild letter delicately phrased it, a children's tutor hired to instruct young nobles in court history was overheard describing Clara as an infection the crown had allowed to spread. Clara did not confront the woman. She simply absorbed it, the way she had absorbed so many small cruelties throughout her life, telling herself she was used to being overlooked and unwanted, though she had never before had to be unwanted quite this publicly, or quite this often. A formal council session called ostensibly to discuss border trade devolved instead into a barely veiled debate about the wisdom of royal intermarriage with humans, a debate conducted as though Clara herself were not seated in the gallery, listening to men who had never spoken a single word to her decide aloud whether she was fit to exist near their prince. One counselor, Lord Wren, spoke at particular length about ancient precedent, about a law, old, rarely invoked, but still technically active, that required any union threatening the throne's succession to be reviewed by the full council before proceeding. He did not look at Clara once while saying it. He did not need to. Orion stood that day and said the thing that would ripple through the court for months afterward. If loving her threatens the throne, then perhaps the throne has been built on something that was always going to eventually break. It was the first time Clara understood how much this courtship was going to cost him, not simply socially, but structurally, in ways neither of them could yet fully measure. And it was the first time she began to wonder, quietly, fearfully, whether Lord Wren's mention of ancient precedent had been a passing argument or a warning about something far more specific than either of them yet understood. That night, walking home from the palace under guard for the first time in her life, Clara noticed a folded note tucked inside her cloak pocket that had not been there that morning. She did not recognize the handwriting. It read only, "Ask him about Queen Marin before it's too late to matter." She had never heard the name before. She would not forget it again. There was, in the days that followed, a smaller moment Clara almost missed entirely, amid the larger fear the note had planted in her. Orion, learning that a guild had withdrawn its palace kitchen contract specifically to avoid serving her table, quietly redirected an equally large contract to a rival guild willing to take the business. Not as a grand gesture, not announced publicly, simply done the way he did most things that mattered to him. Clara only learned of it weeks later, from a kitchen steward who mentioned it in passing, and understood, hearing it, that Orion's love for her was made of exactly these small, unglamorous acts of protection, far more than any public declaration ever could be. If you've been holding your breath with them, subscribe to Elf Stories, like this video, and tell us where you're watching from. The truth is closer than you think. Clara asked Orion about Queen Maren the following evening, expecting confusion, expecting him to have no idea what she meant. Instead, his face went still in a way she had never seen before. "Where did you hear that name?" he asked quietly. She told him about the note. He was silent for a long moment, before he finally, reluctantly, told her a story the Silverglen court had spent nearly 2 centuries trying to erase from its own memory. He led her, that same night, to a small portrait hidden away in a rarely visited wing of the palace. A woman with kind eyes and an uncertain smile, painted in a style 2 centuries out of fashion. "I found this room by accident when I was 12, Orion admitted. "No one would tell me who she was. I asked my tutor once and watched him turn the color of old parchment before changing the subject entirely. I stopped asking after that. I told myself it wasn't worth the trouble it clearly caused whoever I asked." Clara studied the portrait's face, struck by something she could not name. Recognition, perhaps, of a woman who had once stood exactly where she now stood, hoping for exactly what she now hoped for. Queen Maren had not always been elven nobility by birth. She had been human, the wife of a Silverglen prince 3 generations before Orion's own father, brought into the royal line during a brief, hopeful period when the crown had genuinely believed intermarriage might strengthen ties between the 2 peoples rather than threaten them. Maren had been beloved by all accounts. Clever, warm, deeply committed to the kingdom she had married into. She had also, according to the histories Orion had only been permitted to read once he came of age, died under circumstances the official records described only as an unfortunate accident, a description Orion had never fully believed, even as a child, though he had never had proof enough to challenge it. What he had not known, what no one outside a small circle of the oldest council members had known, until Clara's mysterious note forced him to finally demand the sealed court archives be opened, was the truth Lord Wren's family had spent 2 centuries protecting. Queen Maren had not died by accident. She had been quietly, deliberately removed by a council faction convinced that her human bloodline, however beloved, represented an unacceptable risk to the throne's stability, a threat they eliminated rather than debated. In the aftermath, that same faction had authored the very ancient precedent Lord Wren had cited in council, a law invented after Maren's death, dressed in old language to appear as though it had always existed, designed specifically to ensure no future human ever stood close enough to the throne to be loved the way Maren had been loved. The law Clara now stood accused of threatening was never ancient at all. It was a lie, built from a murder, worn smooth by 200 years of repetition, until an entire kingdom had forgotten it had ever been anything else. Clara felt the floor of her understanding shift entirely. The prejudice she had absorbed her whole life, the quiet, pervasive certainty that someone like her did not belong beside someone like Orion, had never been ancient wisdom. It had been manufactured deliberately by people protecting their own power, and inherited by generations who never thought to question where it came from. Worse still, Orion admitted, his voice rough with an anger she had never heard from him before. Lord Wren's family had authored that original law, the same family now leading the council's opposition to Clara. They were not defending old tradition. They were protecting a 2-century-old cover-up, terrified that Clara's marriage to Orion might finally expose what their ancestors had done. "They killed her," Clara said quietly, "and then they built a law out of her death to make sure it could never happen again, meaning someone like her could never be loved like that again." Orion nodded, his jaw tight. "And if I marry you, publicly, defiantly, In the same way my ancestor once tried and failed to protect Marin, Ren's family will do whatever it takes to make sure history doesn't repeat itself, not because they fear for the kingdom, because they fear being exposed." He was quiet a long moment before adding more softly, "I used to think my ancestor failed her because he wasn't strong enough. I understand now, he simply never told anyone the truth in time. He tried to protect her with silence, the same way my father tried to protect this family with silence. It didn't work then. I refuse to believe it will work differently now." Clara understood, standing in the quiet aftermath of that revelation, that she was no longer only fighting for her own place beside Orion. She was standing, without ever having asked for the role, exactly where a murdered queen had stood 200 years before her, and that the same forces that had ended Marin's life were very likely willing to do whatever it took to end this story the same way. She thought, too, of every small cruelty she had absorbed over the past year and quietly forgiven, telling herself it was simply the price of loving someone above her station. She understood now that none of it had ever been about her station at all. It had been about a lie 2 centuries old, still working exactly as its authors intended, still convincing good people to distrust something that had never deserved their distrust in the first place. The realization did not make her afraid, not entirely. It made her, for the first time since the wedding stones had flown, quietly and completely furious. If this revelation shook you the way it shook her, subscribe to Elf Stories, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're listening from. The hardest part of her story is still ahead. The night before their wedding, Clara nearly left, not out of doubt in her love for Orion, that had never once wavered, but out of a fear that had grown sharper with every day since learning the truth about Queen Marin. If Lord Ren's family had been willing to end a queen's life to protect a lie 2 centuries ago, Clara had no reason to believe they would hesitate now, with so much more at stake and so much more to lose. That fear had sharpened further only days earlier, when Clara's mare was found lame in her stall, under circumstances the palace stable master could not explain. And a second note, this one far less gentle than the first, had appeared beneath her door, warning her that Fenhollow remembered how to keep its own and would welcome her back before it was too late. She had not shown the note to Orion. She told herself she did not want to give Lord Ren's family the satisfaction of watching fear work exactly as intended. Privately, she had begun sleeping with a small blade beneath her pillow, a habit she was deeply ashamed of and could not bring herself to stop. She packed a small bag in the quiet of the guest chambers Orion had insisted she be given inside the palace walls, fully intending to disappear back to Fenhollow before dawn, not because she wanted to stop loving him, but because she could not bear the thought of becoming the reason his kingdom finally turned on him completely, or the reason his story ended the way Marin's had. Elder Fenwick found her at the gates, as though some old instinct had told him exactly where to look. He did not try to stop her. He simply said, "Marin left too, you know, near the end. She tried to disappear once, to spare her prince the fight. He found her before she made it past the second gate. And he told her the same thing I'm about to tell you. Love that runs from a fight was never going to survive one. The kind that stays is the only kind worth this much cost. And she still died," Clara said quietly. "She did," Fenwick agreed, "because she was alone in that fight, protected by a prince who loved her, but never once let the truth into the light. You have something she never had. You have a truth already spoken aloud, to people who can no longer pretend not to have heard it." Fenwick took her hands then, the way he had when she was a grieving child, too young to understand why her mother wasn't coming back. "I did not raise you to run from hard things, Clara. I raised you to survive them. There is a difference, and you have always known it, even when you were too frightened to trust it." Clara returned to the palace before dawn, not because her fear had disappeared, but because she understood finally that running would not protect Orion. It would simply hand Wren's family exactly what they wanted without a fight at all. The wedding proceeded as planned, under guard, under a hostility so thick Clara could feel it pressing against her skin as she walked the aisle. The same crowd that had thrown stones at their carriage the day the truth first became public, now packed into the palace grounds, watching in tense, uncertain silence. The wedding proceeded as planned, under guard, under a hostility so thick Clara could feel it pressing against her skin as she walked the aisle. The same crowd that had thrown stones at their carriage the day the truth first became public, now packed into the palace grounds, watching in tense, uncertain silence. Clara searched the crowd once, briefly, for Elder Fenwick's face, and found it near the front, steady and unafraid, and let that steadiness carry her the rest of the way and down the aisle. It was during the ceremony itself, in the pause before the final vows, that Lord Wren made his final move. He rose from the gathered council, invoking the old law formally, publicly, demanding the union be halted pending review. The same law, Clara now understood, that had been forged from his own ancestors' crime. His voice carried easily across the silent grounds, practiced and confident, the voice of a man who had spent 2 centuries of inherited certainty, believing no one would ever dare challenge him. Orion did not raise his voice. He simply turned in front of the entire assembled kingdom and did the one thing Wren's family had spent 2 centuries ensuring no prince would ever have the courage to do. He ordered the sealed archives opened, publicly, right there, and had the original, unaltered account of Queen Marin's death read aloud to every noble, every guard, every citizen who had gathered to watch his wedding become a trial. The silence that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever heard. The particular silence of an entire crowd, realizing all at once that the prejudice they had inherited as ancient wisdom had been manufactured to hide a murder. The silence that followed was unlike anything Clara had ever heard. The particular silence of an entire crowd, realizing all at once that the prejudice they had inherited as ancient wisdom had been manufactured to hide a murder. Somewhere near the back of the gathered crowd, Clara heard someone begin to weep. Not for her, she realized, but for Marin, dead 200 years, and finally being mourned by people who had never known to mourn her before. Lord Wren did not deny it. His face, pale and rigid, told the truth his voice refused to. He looked, for one brief moment, not like a powerful counselor, but like a man watching 2 centuries of his family's careful architecture collapse in the span of a single afternoon. King Alaric, who had remained distant and unreadable throughout the entire courtship, rose from his own seat for the first time that day. Clara braced herself for one final blow. A father, she assumed, about to defend the throne's old order one last time. Instead, the king turned to Lord Wren's family and, in a voice that shook with something between grief and fury, said, "My grandfather let this happen. My father let this lie stand. I will not be the third king to let a woman like her pay for a crime none of you have ever answered for." He turned next to Orion, and something in his expression softened into a regret Clara had never once seen him show. "I told myself my silence was caution," he said quietly, though the whole court could hear him. It was cowardice wearing caution's face. "I am sorry it took me this long, and this much courage from both of you, to finally say so." He turned to Orion and Clara, and in front of the entire kingdom, gave the order that ended 200 years of quiet cruelty. The law was struck down, effective immediately, and Lord Wren's family was to answer formally for the truth they had buried for so long. Clara married Orion that afternoon, in a silence that had transformed, slowly, from hostility into something closer to reckoning. Not everyone in that crowd left believing love between their kinds was simple, or safe, or free of consequence, but no one left believing any longer that it was wrong. Near the palace gates, as the newly married couple passed, Clara saw an old woman who had once spat at her carriage step forward instead, silent, and press a single white flower into her hand before disappearing back into the crowd. Clara never learned her name. She kept the flower anyway, pressed between the pages of her father's old book, for the rest of her life. If her story has moved you this far, subscribe to Elf Stories, like this video, and tell us where in the world you're watching from tonight. Her ending is almost here. The kingdom did not change overnight. Clara had known from the very beginning that it wouldn't. There were still nobles who refused to receive her, still whispers that followed her through certain corridors of the palace, still merchants in distant provinces who spoke of the human queen with more suspicion than warmth. Real change, she had learned by then, never arrived all at once. It arrived in inches, fought for again and again, by people willing to stand still inside the resistance instead of running from it. There were difficult days, even years into their marriage. A diplomatic dinner where a visiting noble pointedly refused to address her directly, a season where crop failures in a distant province were quietly, unfairly blamed on the changes the crown had allowed. Clara learned to carry those days without letting them convince her, the way they once might have, that she did not belong. She had proof now, carved into palace record and portrait alike, that she did. But there were other things too. A young human girl from a border town, not unlike Fen Hollow, presented at court for the first time without a single objection raised. A council seat, once reserved only for elven-blooded nobility, quietly opened to petition from mixed families. Elder Fenwick, invited to the capital as an honored guest, who cried openly the first time he saw Clara's name carved beside Orion's on the palace's official registry. Not as an exception, but as precedent. Clara often thought of Queen Marin in the years that followed, standing sometimes in the palace archive where her true story was now displayed rather than buried. A portrait finally restored to the honor she had been denied in death. Clara understood, looking at that portrait, that she had not simply married a prince. She had finished something a murdered queen had started 2 centuries before her and never gotten the chance to complete. On quiet evenings, Clara sometimes brought fresh flowers to that small restored portrait, standing a while in a silence that felt less like grief now and more like gratitude. She never spoke aloud in that room. She never felt she needed to. Marin's painted eyes seemed to Clara, at least, to already understand everything she might have said. Orion, older now, still reached for Clara's hand, the same way he had the day the stones flew, steady, certain, unwilling to let go regardless of who was watching. Their children, when they came, grew up hearing the true story of Queen Marin, not as a shameful family secret, but as the reason their own parents' marriage had ever been possible at all. A lesson in what silence costs and what courage eventually repays. Change, Clara had come to understand, was never owed gratitude by the people it challenged. It only ever earned resistance first, and meaning after. Sometimes, on quiet mornings before the palace fully woke, Clara walked the same corridor where Marin's restored portrait now hung, and thought of Fen Hollow, the small border post, the water-stained book, the father who loved her in a language he never learned to speak aloud. She did not resent the girl she had been, the one who built her whole worth on being useful. She simply understood her differently now, the way one understands an old wound once it has finally fully healed, not as a weakness to hide, but as the exact shape of the strength that carried her here. She decided, watching her husband govern a kingdom, slowly learning to be worthy of him. That meaning had always been worth the fight. and that some love stories are never really about two people at all, but about everyone brave enough to come after them.